what does this mean to have non-trivial knowledge a priori? You can have knowledge like that contained in a definition. If I say a bachelor is an unmarried man, then just saying, now I have the a priori knowledge that bachelors are unmarried men. Yeah, okay, I have this, but that's not useful knowledge because this is already contained in the definition, right? So just by having the definition, I have this knowledge. And you can argue mathematics is also like that, right? That 2 and 2 is 4 is already contained somehow in the definition of 2 and the operation of adding them up. So it doesn't give me really any new knowledge. And now the question is, can I have in my mind a priori knowledge that's not based on experience, but that is actually new knowledge that is not contained in the definitions of things? And this is what Kant calls later synthetic a priori knowledge. Synthetic means it's something new. It's not contained in the definition, which would be analytic knowledge, but a priori means I have it before I have any experience. So is there such a thing as synthetic a priori knowledge? And this will become Kant's main concern later. It's not right here at this point. And up until Hume has Hume's fork, which we will talk about when we talk about Hume. And Hume's fork essentially is this. It says we have a fork, right, not for eating, but a fork in the road of philosophy, in a sense, that every statement is either analytic and then it does not tell us anything, or it is synthetic, then it gives us information, and all the analytic statements I can know a priori, and all the synthetic ones I know a posteriori. I know them after having experience. So either I have experience, then I have statements that are not certain, because my experience is never certain, right? But they are meaningful, they give me new information. Or I have analytic statements which are certain, but they don't give me any new information about the world. And this is Hume's fork. But Kant disputes this. He says, perhaps they are synthetic a priori. They are statements that do give me new information, but I know them without experience. And what this means we will talk about later when we talk about Kant. Now what happens with language? Locke is a source of beautiful questions. He does not always give the best answers to his questions, but he has, like Descartes, great questions. And so Locke is also one of the first to engage with the question of language. How does language get its meaning? Is the beginning of the philosophy of language. What do I mean when I say bottle, and how does this even work? Because I only have the particular bottle. I call this bottle, let's say, Peter, right? But this does not have me identify another bottle that is not Peter. So we have these abstract words that denote, categories of things like bottles, cameras, trees, leaves, clouds. And how does this work? How do these words come about? Because we never experience these abstract things in themselves, right? I've never actually experienced bottle. I've only experienced this bottle and the other bottle. So what does my mind do when it creates the word bottle? And now Locke first says, for language to be meaningful, it must always be rooted in some sensory experience. So when I make words that do not have a sensory experience corresponding to them, then these words are meaningless. Something like the words of rationalism. So words like God or cause or, the meaning of life, truth of God, all these things that are abstract words that don't have any experience corresponding to them. And Locke would say these are meaningless. What I can meaningfully talk about is blue, cylinder, gray, soft, hard, water, because these words have a corresponding experience. So this is a correspondence theory of meaning, right, that Locke goes into here. And so our knowledge is always based on these simple things, and our language is based on these simple experiences that I create ideas for in my mind, or they are created. I don't even create them. They are, involuntary. They're given to me. And so now I have these ideas in my mind, and then I attach words to them. And these words are meaningful. These words I can talk about. And this was very influential. This goes down to the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century. You have the Vienna Circle, Carnap and Schlick and so on. And these people had exactly the same concerns about language. They said when people like Heidegger write the nothings, then this is a misuse of language. It doesn't mean anything because there is no correspondence. And so the only meaningful words for the Vienna Circle are what they call protocol statements. Here now blue, here now cold. These are meaningful because they represent an experience, they represent a sensory experience. And so all our language must be rooted in sensory experiences. Yeah, and so you see how things are connected across centuries, right? From Locke to the Vienna Circle, you have the same problem being discussed and often answered in similar ways. Now, despite his empiricism, Locke also could not completely go away from God and religion, which is a feature of his time. No philosopher back then could afford to say God does not exist, because they all know what happened to Galileo, who tried to change astronomy in ways that were perceived as not being compatible with Christian belief, and then he spent the rest of his life in home arrest. Or Spinoza, who was exiled from his community, his Jewish community, was excommunicated, and then he had to go and live somewhere else and grind lenses. So nobody wanted to have such a life, and so Locke also tried to avoid it. He mentions a proof for the existence of God, and he talks about these causal arguments for the existence of God. We know for certain, he says, that God exists, but we have no innate idea of God. We know that we exist. This we know from Descartes. We have a clear idea that we exist, but we also know that nothing can produce being. So if there is nothing, this nothing cannot produce something that exists. Nothing, comes spontaneously out of nothing. And so therefore, since we exist and nothing can come out of nothing, and the idea of God exists, then these things must have come from somewhere, and they must have some other reason why they are here. And then I can ask, in turn, what is the reason that these things exist, these reasons exist? And so I get this chain of reasons, and this chain must end somewhere, and then it ends with something that is eternal and powerful and most knowing, and this thing is God. This is a bad argument, and I don't really believe that Locke would not have seen the problems with this argument. And if you want to know why this is a bad argument, you can go back a few episodes where we talk about Descartes' proofs of God. Descartes has 3 proofs of God, and one of them is this one. And you can see why this is a bad argument. So go there and have a look at it. Now let's go to complex ideas. All ideas that are not simple are complex. And complex, again, with the Lego bricks means that I take these simple Lego bricks, I combine them in different ways, and I get things that are not originally contained in the Lego bricks, right? I get a castle, and a castle is something different from the individual bricks. So I create new ideas in my mind out of this basic idea. So for example, I create the idea of a water bottle by combining water, cylinder, cap, sleeve, whatever, and then I get the idea of a water bottle. And even abstract ideas like causal power, right? I cannot see causality, but I can see, one thing happening, another thing happening, and the regularity with which they happen. And then my mind creates the idea of causal power. This is almost what Hume says. Later, Hume becomes famous for this, right? For his criticism of causality. But Locke is not quite there. He already talks about causality, he already talks about how we cannot see it, but he draws, Hume would say, the wrong conclusion from it. Locke says, okay, we cannot see it, but our minds can create the idea, and so causality is there as an idea, while Hume would say causality does not even exist, it's just a belief of us. But we don't need to, go there now. We will talk about it later when we talk about Hume. So we derive, he says, the idea of causal connection from correlation. And we can do this with all sorts of, complex ideas, abstract ideas, and we cannot think without abstract ideas. We need abstract ideas, right? Because even when we use a predicate, when we say, this bottle is blue, then I need an abstract idea of blueness. Or when I say it's a cylinder, I need an abstract idea of a cylinder. I cannot only have the idea of this particular cylinder, right? When I say something is cylindrical, the cylindrical in this way is a category, so I need an abstract idea of cylindricness in order for this sentence to work, right? So every predicate involves an abstract idea. And so how does the mind generate abstract ideas from particular ideas? Because we only have particular ideas. We never see cylindricness, we never see bottleness. So where does this come from? And Locke says there are essentially two mechanisms. We can bring together separate ideas into a whole, we can combine them, in this way, or we can separate ideas into components, the opposite. We can analyze ideas, we can abstract, Locke calls this abstraction. And this is the basis of all complex human thoughts, these two mechanisms. So when I see, this blue thing, I don't yet have an idea of blueness. I just have this simple idea of this blue. But then I also see the sky, and then I also see the car over there, and then I see, many other blue things, the water, the sea, and so on. And after I've seen so many blue things, I notice the similarity, that many of these blue things are similar in a particular way, which I call blueness. And so I create through abstraction this idea of blueness. And the same with cars, right? I see one car, another car, a third car, they all look different, but they all have some similar features. They all have four wheels, they all have a shape that looks somewhat similar, some windows on them, an engine, some wheels. So then in the end I call these similar features car. And so car is a meaningful word, although I have never seen car, I've only seen this car and that car, but it's still meaningful because it's created by abstraction from words that are inherently meaningful because they have a correspondence in a simple sensation. So Locke says words become general by being made the sign of general ideas. And again, this is a contested statement. We will see later. This does not always work out, and others have criticized it. Berkeley criticizes it, Hume criticizes it. They think things work slightly differently. But Locke is the first one, so obviously his idea about this is not so elaborate as perhaps later his critics will be able to work upon what Locke started, right, and make it more complex. For Locke, words become general by being made the sign of general ideas. So I have particular sensations of bottles. Now, through a process of abstraction, I get the abstract idea of bottle, not of this bottle, but of bottle in general. And now I want to communicate this by creating the word bottle, which I attach to the abstract idea of bottle. General ideas are derived from particular ideas by abstraction. And so, another example, right? I have many ideas of dogs, big, small, brown, black, white dogs, different races of dogs. When we put them together, like superimposing photos, right? Imagine you have 10 pictures of dogs and put them on top of each other, half transparent, and then you can see the other pictures through, right? And you stack them on top of each other, and whatever is common you call dog, and whatever is different in each individual dog, you just ignore it. And so you get dogness. And now, how does communication through words happen? The mind has an idea inside it. I have an idea in my mind of bottle. The idea has a word attached to it, bottle. And now I say the word bottle to you, and in your ears, perceive the word, it goes into your mind. It gets attached to the idea that you have in your mind. And now we have communicated successfully because my idea has triggered your idea of bottle through the common use of this word. And now you can dispute this, of course, as Berkeley has later done, because Berkeley says, do I really have an idea of bottle? We will talk about this later, but you can start thinking about it. Do you have an idea in your mind of bottleness, of an abstract bottle? What happens when you think about bottle? Think right now of bottle and see what your mind comes up with. And Berkeley will say, your mind will not see an abstract bottle. If I say dog, what comes into your mind? Not an abstract dog. You see that dog you saw yesterday. You see your dog. You see your bottle. You see an impressive bottle that you remember from, memory. But you never see an abstract bottle. So perhaps Locke is wrong by saying that abstract words are the sign of abstract ideas. Perhaps there are no abstract ideas. Perhaps it works differently. But okay, this is a criticism. We will talk about this later. For Locke, it's very important that you have this correspondence of words to complex ideas. Complex ideas can be analyzed to simple ideas. Simple ideas are in the end coming from sensation, because this gives languages meaning. This guarantees that I can actually talk about things meaningfully. And this also can go wrong sometimes. So for example, I can use words although I am not sure what they mean. I can misuse language in this sense. And we are doing it. All of us are doing it, right? If I tell you now, virus, light, concepts like this, things that are, real things. But you know what light is, right? You know what a virus is. But how much do you really know? If you're not a biologist, do you really know what a virus is? And probably not. You have a somewhat diffuse idea of what a virus is. You know a little bit about viruses, but perhaps not everything. Or when I say light, you don't have the full idea of light that a theoretical physicist would have who studies light, right? He will have some ideas about formulas, the speed of light, whatever else is related to the physics of light. You don't have these ideas in your mind. For you, light is just what makes you see when you flip the switch, right, in your bedroom. But this is not the full concept of light. That's a simplified concept of light. So our ideas are not always representing things correctly. It can even be worse. A child, for example, can say words like government or inflation, and the child might have a totally wrong idea about what is behind that. Or it might have an idea that is partially correct, but surely not full. If a 5-year-old child says government, and, again, it's not a prodigy, it's not John Stuart Mill, but somebody, normal, the 5-year-old child will not know what government means precisely. It will know it's some kind of, daddy for the state, but for the country. But it will not know exactly how it works, what the mechanisms of the government are. And even we as normal grown-up citizens don't know really often how the government works. A lawyer would know more, right, about our constitution and what the limits are of the government power and so on. But we will perhaps not even know these things. It's still okay. We can communicate, we can work with it, but we need to be aware, Locke says, about our limitations. Because in these limitations is the potential to misuse words, to use them wrongly, to have wrong concepts in your mind, and then to really miscommunicate and produce errors in thought, right? To influence others in wrong ways because you have mistaken ideas in your mind. So we should, he says, always make sure that we use words only if we have a clear idea attached to them. The ideas attached to our words must be as clear as possible. We must avoid ambiguities, and every time we use a word, we must use it to refer to the same idea, and we must inform others about the definitions that we use and the concepts we have in our minds, so that we make sure that we communicate correctly. So every time we use a word, there must be a shared idea about what this word means, and this shared idea must be as precise as possible to make sure that we use the word correctly. Of course, this is kind of an ideal, a philosophical idea that is not very practical. We cannot possibly make sure that the whole of the population has a fully correct scientific idea of government, the powers of government, the limitations of government, the procedures of government, plus a correct idea of viruses and how they work and their biochemistry, plus a correct idea about light and how photons work and whether light is a wave or a particle. All these things. We cannot make sure that human beings have these correct ideas, all of us. It's just impossible. Yeah? There's too much knowledge in the world. Perhaps in Locke's time it would look a little more feasible, but not in our time anymore. So we have to live with the fact that we have different degrees of ideas, different degrees of knowledge about things, and that our ideas are always to some extent inadequate ideas or incomplete ideas about things. Now let's talk about Locke and the degrees of knowledge. Locke accepts that we have different degrees of certainty about our ideas, about knowledge that we have. And the first kind is intuitive knowledge, as he calls it. Again, you have to be careful with these words, because these words are used very differently by different philosophers. Intuitive knowledge for Locke is knowledge that I perceive directly, where I am immediately convinced of its truth just because my mind immediately sees clearly and distinctly that this is true. This is different from Kant. When Kant talks about intuition, he means perhaps more like what Locke means when he talks about senses and sensory perception. So intuition for Kant is something that comes through my sensory apparatus, while intuition for Locke is an idea that's already in my mind and that is perfectly certain. The connection between two ideas, perhaps, that is perfectly certain. So this is the best kind of knowledge. And this comes from mechanisms of our mind, right? We said our mind is a tabula rasa regarding content, but it does have some particular mechanisms of how to operate on these ideas. And so this is what makes some ideas certain. So when I say black is not white or a circle is not a square, then these are things that are certain in my mind because my mind itself makes sure that these ideas are kept separate and they are not the same. The second kind of ideas that are a little less forceful and immediate, as Hume would later say, are ideas that I get from demonstrative knowledge. So now, for example, the idea that the sum of the angles in a triangle is 180 degrees. This is not something that I know by intuition. If you tell me this thing, I will be surprised if I don't know it already, right? I will not really think that it's true. I will not immediately see that it's true, especially if you think about very different triangles. Some are very long and some are very, equal-sided, and they all should have a sum that's 180 degrees. This is not immediately clear, right? And But we can know it for certain through a demonstration. Somebody can come and bring us multiple triangles and demonstrate and perhaps show us the reason why by drawing a few diagrams and doing some trigonometry, and he can prove that this must be the case always. And so we will be convinced. After this we know it, and it's certain knowledge now. But it's a little less certain because it requires a demonstration first. It's not immediately obvious to the mind. And the last kind is the sensitive knowledge. It's knowledge that comes from the outside through sensations. And this knowledge is the least certain. We have to rely on it because our mind does not have any other content. It only comes through the senses. But it is the least certain. We can be mistaken about our sensations. Even Locke would agree to this. If it's dark and I don't see colors properly, I can see something green and think that it's blue. Or something is, far away, I don't see it clearly, I can be mistaken about the distance. Or I can be mistaken about its size. Sometimes you see something, some shadow, you think it's something small, you go closer, it turns out to be huge because you thought it's in the distance, but now it's much closer, so it's bigger than you thought. This happens all the time, right, with our senses. So sensitive knowledge, sensation knowledge is the least certain, but of course it's necessary, we need it. Now let's stop here. This is the first part of Locke's theory of ideas, and then we will soon in another episode talk about qualities, and this is another very exciting part of Locke's philosophy.